welcome to this video. We're very lucky to be joined today by Ali Sherrick. Would you like to say hello, Ali?
Hi everyone, delighted to be here with you today. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yes, I think we've all been looking forward to this. Ali is a wonderful children's author. She's written Black Powder, The Buried Crown, and The Queen's Fall, which can see behind us.
Which is our current children's book of the month. So come in to Guildford Library and get yourself a copy.
Absolutely, yeah. So we've got some questions we're going to ask Ali, including some from children who come into the library. So we're really excited, and yeah, let's make a start. So the first section is questions about the books themselves, Ali. One of the books we've been highlighting recently, last month's Children's Book of the Month, was The Buried Crown. Can you tell us what The Buried Crown is about?
Yes, well, as luck would have it, I have my own copy here. Ta-da! And The Buried Crown is a story set in 1940, so in the Second World War, in Suffolk, but near a very special place, which is a true, real place. It's called Sutton Hoo. And the year before the war, they discovered an amazing ship burial there, full of treasure, an Anglo-Saxon ship burial. And so my story is using some real life events, but spinning my own tale about a young evacuee called George Penny, who comes from London, and he comes to live near his brother Charlie, who's a Spitfire pilot training nearby. He's staying with a wicked farmer called Bill Jarvis, and he's desperate to escape and try to find his brother at the RAF station. And there's a whole bunch of events that spill out of this. And he meets a young girl called Kitty, who's a German Jewish refugee. And it turns out that her granddad was one of the archaeologists working on the dig for the Sutton Hoo ship burial before the war. And Kitty and her granddad believe that there's an item of treasure that's been left in the ground. Okay, and no clues because it's on the cover. But it's a crown with a special magic attached to it as well. And somebody else is after that crown too, a certain Adolf Hitler and his Nazi treasure hunters. And so it's a story all about how George and Kitty must try to stop the Nazis from getting hold of this crown, and all sorts of things spill out of that. So there we are. I hope that gives you an idea of what the story is about.
It does, yeah. So the book, as you've said, is set in World War II, and the main character, George, is an evacuee. So I wonder what inspired you to write about that time period particularly?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Well, I'll be honest and say that I grew up on a diet of stories about the war because my dad, who was also called George, was an evacuee. And he was from London, like George Penny in my story. He actually went to Wales, to a place called Pembrokeshire on the west coast of Wales. And he was an evacuee there. And I'm sad to say that I don't think he discovered any buried treasure, which is a shame. But, you know, he had lots of stories about his adventures in the countryside there, which I used to love listening to when I was growing up. So partly it was him and his stories. And then also the Sutton Hoo ship burial treasure. I actually studied that at university. I did a medieval history degree. And we did all about the Anglo-Saxons, and then I visited Sutton Hoo with my husband a few years ago. It's owned by the National Trust now, and you can visit it and see the ancient burial mounds, and they have some of the original treasure there and some replica treasure that they discovered, and a big model of the ship that they found this treasure in. And it's a very special place, and places are often the inspirations for my stories as well. So it was a kind of mashup between the two. And then obviously your author's brain goes spinning into overdrive, and you come up with all sorts of invented things as well.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah.
Interesting.
So yeah, George and Kitty do dig up something quite special in the book. I wondered, along with your interest in history. Have you ever dug up anything interesting yourself?
Well, actually, funnily enough, I was on holiday again with my husband a few years ago, and we were in Spain, and we visited an old Roman city. I mean, it's been, it's ruins now, but the archaeologists have uncovered the layers, and there's some amazing mosaics and the remains of an arena where the gladiators used to fight and all that sort of thing. And we were there, and I was just sort of pottering around. There were what these archaeologists call spoil heaps, which are little heaps of dug material, if you like, gravel and stones that they've discarded. And I don't know why, but I was just sort of standing near one of these. They'd obviously had a dig in the summer there, and something caught my eye, and it was a sort of beautiful greeny blue, iridescent, sort of shiny piece of glass. And it was partly covered. And I lifted it out, and it was a fragment, but it was a fragment of a bottle. And it was clear from the glass that it was Roman glass. I mean, I've seen that sort of stuff in museums before. And it was beautiful, of course. It was only tiny, but I was like, oh, wow, and of course my instinct was, I want to take this home with me, and put it on my bookshelves with all my other little souvenirs. But I knew that was the wrong thing to do, because, it was perhaps something the archaeologists had overlooked. But, I know that you're not meant to go around digging things up and taking them. So I was very good, and I actually fitted it back in the space I'd taken it from, and I just left it there. I just thought, hey, I don't know if they wanted it or not, but they'll find it if it's meant to be found. So yeah, so that was a very special moment to touch that piece of Roman glass.
That's quite extraordinary. Yeah.
Oh,
excellent. Oh, thank you for telling us a bit about the Buried Crown. So The Queen's Fall is this month's children's book of the month. Can you give us a little bit of information about what that's about?
And this is your most recent book, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. It came out in February this year, so it's very new. And in fact, I've got two copies of this. I've got the paperback here, and then there is the audio book, which I think Surrey Libraries are also making available for people if they want to borrow it. It's published by a company called Ulverscroft, and there's a marvellous narrator called Charlotte Strevens, who does a wonderful job of all the voices. But yes, the book itself is actually set earlier in time than The Buried Crown. It's set in the year 1520, so just over 500 years ago. And it's at the time of Henry VIII and his first queen, Catherine of Aragon. So he's the famous Tudor king who you might know went round chopping lots of people's heads off for all sorts of reasons. But fortunately, in my story, this is before he turned into that kind of rather tyrannical, older version of himself. And he's still quite a young, glamorous man in this story, and very much in love with his first wife. It's actually the story of two young people, Cat Sparrow, who you can see the cover artist Georgie McCauston has drawn on here. Cat Sparrow lives in a convent with her older sister Meg. They're both orphans, and that's where you find them at the start of the story. But then a man rides in one day quite unexpectedly on a big thundery black horse, as Cat calls it, and he steals Meg away, and he takes her to London. And so Cat is a very determined sort of character, and of course she loves Meg to bits, and she's desperate to be reunited with her. So she sets out, perhaps rather unwisely because the roads were dangerous in those days, she sets out on her own to head to London and to try to find Meg. She knows nothing more than that she's gone to London. And on the way, fortunately, she meets a young boy called Jacques, a French boy who's traveling with a troupe of actors. And the actors agree to take Cat with them to London. And of course, then events spill out from that. Cat and Jacques become friends, and they end up journeying to France with the king's court. Cat becomes the queen's fool, and they they travel to France for a grand meeting with the French king, but there is a traitorous plot afoot which threatens them all. And of course, Cat and Jacques get caught up with this, along with Jacques' monkey, Pepin. And they have to try and solve the plot before it's all too late. So it's another twisty-turny plot to enjoy.
Brilliant, yeah. I wanted to ask you about Cat, actually. She sees the world in a unique way in The Queen's Fall. And I wondered how you tried to show that in your writing.
Yeah, she's got a very distinctive voice, and I tell it from her point of view, but I also tell it from Jacques' point of view. So it's what you would call a dual narrative. So some chapters are Cat, some chapters are Jacques, and they're both very different characters. But Cat is really the main heroine, and she's a girl who probably in this day and age, you know, you would regard as someone who has learning difficulties. But back in the day, of course, that term wasn't known or understood. And she sort of displays the uniqueness of her voice in a number of different ways. She's got very sensitive hearing, and so very sharp hearing, but also loud noises bother her as well. So she tends to sort of see the world a lot through her hearing, actually. So if you look at scenes where she's describing things, it's often what she's heard first, you know, whether that's the noise of ships' cannons or the tinkling of bells on a horse's harness. They're the things that she hears, and she uses her own unique way of describing. And she's also very good at wordplay, you know, having fun with words. And, you know, I think sometimes she slightly misunderstands things, and she says people's names in a different way. So, for example, she has a keeper when she becomes the Queen's Fool, a woman who is assigned to look after her. And this keeper is called Mistress Bristol, but she has whiskers on the end of her chin, and Cat calls her Mistress Bristles.
That's so interesting. What a great character. Speaking of characters, apart from real historical figures who you've touched upon a little bit, are any of the characters in your books based on people you know?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because I do remember there's a little saying that, you know, I don't know who came up with it, but, you know, if you're thinking about, you know, writing stories and somebody annoys you, then you can sort of be rather cunning and say, be careful or you might end up in my book. Which, you know, obviously for the people that you don't like, you could turn them into your villains. You know, for the people that you admire, you could turn them into your heroes and heroines. But I can't honestly say, you know, that I've looked at anyone that I know and said, yes, you know, I'm going to use your personality and put you in my book. I think it's a bit less obvious than that. You know, there are sort of characteristics that I admire generally in people, like, you know, courage and bravery and speaking the truth. And so I think those sorts of characteristics feature in all of my heroes and heroines, really. And then, yes, I mean, obviously there are all sorts of, you know, not so good characteristics that would work well with a villain that we all know about, you know, people who are spiteful and bully people, you know, or try to belittle them. But I can't honestly say that I think, oh yes, you know, so and so, you are going to make a perfect character to my book. It doesn't quite work like that, certainly not for me anyway.
I suppose you pull from lots of places, like your knowledge of Sutton Hoo and your father and his stories of being an evacuee.
Yes, I mean, that's right. Obviously, my dad, you know, the fact that he was an evacuee, but he was called George, you know, yes, and he was quite an adventurous sort of little boy from what I can gather. So that, yes, you're right, that's sort of certainly come into his character. But it's a bit of a melting pot, really, an author's brain. You know, we're magpies and we like stealing little bits from all over the place and bringing them all together.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for telling us about the books. I'm going to hand over to Jenny, who's going to ask some questions about being an author.